Hello bag builders, it's Diane from Spencer Sewing Patterns here to introduce you to my new sewing pattern for the Beanie Baguette. A carb-free way to get your favourite baguette. If we can't eat them, well, we can jolly well wear them. The Beanie Baguette is such an iconic shape that I know you're going to love making, gifting and wearing. It's a nice easy pattern that comes together really quickly. As always, it's designed to be made on a domestic machine and there's no binding anywhere. The pattern for the Beanie Baguette is an instant download and it comes with a full-size computer drafted pattern in 2 sizes, detailed colour photographs and in-depth instructions. There's also a video tutorial to walk with you through every step of this beautiful bag. I'm really excited about this one. It's amazingly quick and easy, but it looks like it's taken forever to make it. And you can make it in just about any fabric going. You can make it more structured or casual with your own choice of interfacings. It's just so flexible and with different looks in different sizes. This bag is the shape of the season and it's great for every fashionista. But I wanted to come at it from a slightly different angle. So I incorporated the straps as a feature of the side seams. They do make a really great feature. The straps are incorporated to allow the shape of the bag to be the star. And adding a little logo badge of your own really makes it sing. The Beanie Baguette looks small, but it really does fit a lot. The approximate finished dimensions are 25 by 19 by 8.5 centimetres, or in inches, that's 10 by 7.5 by 3.25. To add a little zing to the interior, I designed a fun feature inside zip pocket for your valuables. And I also added an interesting new way to add a base to any bag. The Beanie Baguette has a gently curved zipper closure and very cute little engineered V-shaped top corners which aid the smooth zipper placement and give a super cute look. As you probably already know, I do a lot of experimenting to make sure my patterns are as close to perfect as I can make them before launch. I tried the beanie in a variety of sizes and shapes before settling on this one with its gently shaped top edge and side strap construction to make it the perfect underarm baguette shape. But then I made one without the straps and bam, it makes the most gorgeous clutch or zipper pouch. And you know I like to give value for money with my patterns, so I've also included a smaller version to make the baby beanie bag, pouch or mini clutch. The approximate finished dimensions for the small baby beanie version is 20 by 13 by 7 centimetres. And in inches, that's 8 by 5 by 2 3/4. I can see some of you are panicking about the curved zipper. But don't worry about the zip being slightly curved. I promise it's not difficult. The inward curve is super easy and it's not like navigating around an outside sharp bend. It just falls into place. No snipping, no messing. The only hardware required are 2 zips and some webbing. Your choice of fabric will give you totally different looks. You can make it look fun by using quilt cotton and foam, glamorous using a vinyl, or casual using cork, waterproof canvas, or even oilskin and heavy cottons. Quilting your fabric would add a whole new dimension again, or why not add an embroidery or cut and sew the front and back panels before you start. Have a look at some of these visual treats from my amazing testers. What talented people they are. Thank you, as always, to all of them. They actually had a blast experimenting with various fabrics, and I'll walk you through the best options in the video tutorial. The Beanie Baguette is available now on my website or on Etsy, or by clicking on the link below this video. It's instant download and there are full-size pattern pieces for 2 sizes which print onto A4 or US letter size paper, and it comes with written and photographic instructions and a full video tutorial to make the bag along with me in real time. For more Spencer patterns and hardware, why not pop over to spencerog.com. On my YouTube channel, I post regular free patterns as well as tutorials for various products I use and love. Do subscribe so that you know when anything new appears. Members of my Facebook sewing group are such a fun and helpful bunch too. They love to help and support each other, as well as sharing pictures of our Spencer Off makes. Why not join? The link is below. So if you have your tea and chocky bicky at the ready, what are you waiting for? Go sew! Thank you for purchasing the pattern for the Beanie Baguette. I really hope you'll enjoy sewing along with me today. I'll be demonstrating the full version today with the side straps, but if you jump to the end of your PDF document, it will also give the instructions for the version without the straps to make a nice zippy pouch. Also, there's bonus pattern pieces there for a smaller size to make the baby beanie with strap or without as a zippy pouch again to make a matching set. If you need any more help, there's full photographic instructions, of course, in your PDF document, but you can also jump onto the Facebook board. Obviously, I'm there, the moderators have made it, they're all testers too, so lots of help available. So, what are we waiting for? Let's go sew! So just before we start, let's have a quick look at fabric suitable for this project. It really is a flexible one, this, and it works in just about anything. So quilt cottons, canvas and heavyweight cottons, upholstery fabrics, wool and tweed look really effective. Waterproof canvases, lots of different weights of those. That one's a backed one. Cork looks really nice. Different weights of vinyls, oilskin. As I say, really effective. And then you can decide whether you want a casual look or a more structured, sturdy look to it by just changing the interfacing. So I'll show you a few examples. So here we have a quilt cotton version, and this, as I say, is one of my favourites. So to this I've added medium weight fusible interfacing and foam. So you can see there's nothing inside that. That is really nice and sturdy and supports itself. Gives a nice look. Cork here. I haven't used any interfacing on the cork, but again it gives a nice firm bag. You can make it more structured by adding a base into that, and I give you the option to add in a base in the pattern. This is a waterproof canvas, so I've gone for the casual look here, and I haven't added any interfacing or a bag base into that, so you can see it's more of a casual bag. But today I'll be demonstrating that, and I'll be adding a layer of medium weight interfacing to it just to give it a little more structure. You can see it gives a nice shape and look. Here we have a vinyl version, and vinyl is really nice for this project too. Again, no interfacing in that whatsoever on the outer. In fact, I haven't even put a bag base in that. Depending on the firmness of your vinyl, of course. If it's a more flimsy vinyl, you can add a bag base to it as well. This one's a coated nylon. Again, it was just a very cheap off-cut I was trying. That has got a backing on it, so I haven't interfaced that either, though I have put a bag base in it. So just a few examples of what you can do. So as I say, you choose the sturdiness of your bag and how formal, structured or casual you want it to look by changing the interfacings, and I'll give you all the details of those in the written instructions. So let's have a look at the things we're going to need for this project. Outer fabric we've talked about. Today I am going to use a waterproof canvas, but it's quite a lightweight one. It's 600 denier, but there's no waterproof backing on it or anything, so I have backed it with a layer of medium weight fusible interfacing, and I'm just leaving it at that. It will still create like quite a casual effect to the bag. It won't be a really structured one. If you want to add structure, as we say, add a bit of foam. You could add fleece if that's all you've got around. That's fine too, but remember, if you are using a fleece or a foam, make sure you cut it out of the seam allowances before you fuse it onto your fabrics. We don't want it adding bulk to any of our seams, particularly that bottom seam. For my lining, I'm just using quilt cotton. I just recommend quilt cotton for to go with any of your outers. I've backed that with medium weight fusible interfacing. The fusible interfacing I'm using is a medium weight and it's a Violin F220, but you can use a G700, a Pellon SF101, the Shape Flex, anything that's just a medium weight and gives you some body to the bag. You don't need any interfacing if you're using a heavyweight waterproof canvas, cork, vinyl or oilskin. We need 2 zips, a 14-inch number 5 zip or a 14-inch piece of continuous zip, that's 35 centimetres, and we need a number 3 zip for the inside pocket, which is 9 inches, 23 centimetres or longer. Doesn't matter if it's a longer one you're using, this is longer, I'm just going to cut it down. For the strap, we need webbing. Webbing's really good because it's going to keep our layers down in the side seams, and I find if you get a nice quality webbing, it really adds to this project, and that's half of what the project is about, is that feature side seam with the webbing there. So I'm using a nice cotton webbing here today. That's 1 1/4 inch. You can substitute that for 1 1/2 inch as well if you prefer, or if that's all you've got in your stash. I wouldn't go narrower on this project because it tends to look a little bit mean. So 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 inch. In terms of the composition of the webbing, I would go for cotton, like this is cotton with a little sparkle in it of silver. So a nice sturdy cotton webbing, or a nylon seatbelt webbing. So this is an example of that. You'll see this around quite a lot now, and that gives a really nice feature too. I've used that on quite a few of my bags, quite widely available and pretty economical too. What I wouldn't use is polyester webbing. So this is an example of polyester webbing. It's more like strapping we use in industry. I know it's widely available and it's very cheap, but it isn't going to give a really nice professional end product to your bag. So I would kind of steer away from that really. Optionally, we can add some ultra firm stabilizer for the base. And I've used Decaville Heavy here, but you could use a mesh bag base or even a bit of vinyl. We need some all-purpose thread to match. A couple of name tags. I'm going to put one on the strap and I'm going to put a handmade badge on the front of the bag. And double-sided tape can help a bit too if you've got some around, but it's not essential. So as I say, today I'm using this 600 denier waterproof canvas. It doesn't have much of a coating on the back of this, so it's quite soft, so I've added the medium weight fusible interfacing. Just a few tips for the pattern before we start. As normal, cut as accurately as possible. It makes a huge difference to any project. So no need to interface your outer fabric if you're using something heavy like cork, a coated waterproof canvas, oilskin or vinyl. If you're using lightweight quilt cottons for the outer, add a layer of fusible foam, but trim it 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch smaller than the pattern all the way around to keep it out of the seam allowances before fusing it to the outer. Just to mention, this is an underarm style bag, so therefore it has a short strap. If you want a longer strap, just increase the webbing length to whatever suits you. It's not a problem, it won't change anything in the construction. If you're using directional fabric, it should look the same way around as your pattern piece writing. So whatever way the writing is on the pattern piece, make sure that your directional print is in that same direction as that when you're cutting out. As you see from this, some of the pattern pieces are cut on fold. So if you prefer, print 2 of each and stick them together to form a full pattern piece. That's normally what I do, I find it's more accurate. We have the firm bag base, which is optional. So I wouldn't use that with a really firm vinyl. It could make your bottom seam too bulky. I would just use that for more flimsier fabrics where you need the added structure. Leave your pattern pieces pinned to your cut pieces or use the handy labels included to easily identify your cut pieces. As usual, backstitch at the beginning and end of every seam, trim loose threads as you go, press at every stage for a smart finish and use a pressing cloth if you're using vinyl or waterproof canvas or anything that might melt. If you're using continuous zip, zigzag stitch the end close so there's no danger of accidentally pulling the puller off halfway through your project. And of course try and save paper, just print the pattern pieces and you don't need to print out the instructions, you can just follow those along on screen. So go ahead and get everything cut out, print off the pattern sheets, making sure the box actual size is ticked and the shrink to fit or fit to page box is not ticked or your printer's going to reduce the size. There is a 1-inch square control box on the pattern pieces for you to check before cutting. If you need help with opening and printing PDF patterns, I've got a video to help, and I'll link that in the text below, and it's in the instructions too. Each page of the pattern is marked with a description, cut out and taped together as instructed. So you can see the main body pieces are in 4 just to fit on the page. So to stick those together first, and there's little arrows to show you how to stick those together. So go ahead, get everything cut and fused, and we're ready to make a start. So hopefully you're cut out and you're ready to start with me. The seam allowance is 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch throughout unless otherwise stated, and it is included in the pattern piece. Always make sure your glasses and your nail varnish match before you start any major project. So let's prepare our outer panels. So grab your outer front and back pieces A in outer fabric, and you can decorate these any way you want to before you start. So go wild with embroidery, applique, badges. You could even cut and sew them. I'm just adding a handmade logo badge to the front of this. I've added a piece of Decaville to the back for a bit of extra strength. As I say, you can add it anywhere you want to. I've given you a measurement in the pattern piece to have it sort of on the lower third of the bag. I've added it on the top today, and that's about 6 centimetres or 2.5 inches from the top on this particular one. As I mentioned before, if you're going to use lightweight quilt cottons, add your layer of fusible foam, so do that now as well, and make sure that on the back you cut it 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch less than the size of the pattern piece all the way around. So that's our outers prepared. That's pretty painless. Let's start on our lining. So our first operation is to add our lining zip pocket. So take your lower back lining, piece C, flip that over so you've got the wrong side uppermost. Transfer the dotted line from the paper pattern piece onto your fabric. So you can either cut out that section on the pattern piece, or good tip from one of my testers was to just snip the top edge of the pattern, and then you can fold it down so you can save your paper pattern piece again for use. So just pin it back on, clip it back on, and draw that shape onto the top edge. So I've used a biro just so you can see it clearly. Obviously use chalk or a disappearing pen. So now grab your pocket facing piece E. So lay that with the right side uppermost. Take that lower back lining piece C and place it right side down on top. I'm going to centre that across that top edge. And clip it in place. So flip that over just to check that your right sides are facing each other and there's an equal gap at each side of that facing piece. So flip it back over again. So we want that pocket facing underneath, and you're looking at the wrong side of the lower lining panel. And now we want to stitch along all 3 sides of that rectangle we've drawn. So top, across and back up again. Trim up, keep trimming, trimmity trim, trim all the way through. We don't want lots of threads hanging out at the end. Keep it tidy as you go. This is just a bit of an alternative to our letterbox style of zip openings for an inside pocket. Obviously we've done lots of the regular sew the box, turn it through. I just thought this was slightly more interesting, and it makes a nice change. So grab some scissors and we want to snip right into the corners here. So right down to your stitch line. I'll get a smaller pair of scissors. So right into that corner without actually snipping your stitches. The closer you can get, the smoother that'll be when you turn it through. Should have sharpened those first, okay? So that's snipped right into my corners. And now I'm going to trim those seam allowances back. So just leave 1/4 of an inch, 6 mil, something like that. not an exact science, this one, it's just so you can turn it without bulk. And I'm going to take that to the ironing board and I'm going to turn that through and press it. So flip that over. You might find, by the way, it is easier to just press it at the ironing board up a little bit first before you turn it over, maybe even in at the sides, and it'll flow better then when you turn it through. It won't fight you quite so much. And then we'll turn it through and give it a press. Right, let me go and iron that. Okay, that's my facing all nicely pressed. If you find you've got any puckers in these corners, it's just because you haven't snipped quite down to the stitching line itself. So just go back in, give it a little nip without actually nipping your stitches. So nice and flat. Before I go any further, I am going to add a little line of double-sided tape to the back of here. So just along that, the top edge of that, or the bottom edge of that rectangle. And that will help me to position my zip without a struggle. You don't need to, it's just an option. And I add it to the fabric rather than to the zip, because if your tape does happen to be wider than your seam allowance, you're not going to see it afterwards, whereas your zip's going to fold up and you would see any tape on your zip afterwards. So I'll just put that to one side for the moment. I'm going to grab my inside zip pocket lining, and that's fused on the back. So it's right side up. It is actually square, this, so it doesn't matter which way around it is, but if you are using directional print, make sure it looks upside down to you at the moment. Grab your zip and place that right side up as well and centre it across the piece. Clip in place, so both are right side up. I know it looks a little bit odd, but because that pocket bag is going inside afterwards, it will be the right way around that zip. Clip it across the top edge. You can undo that zip or not, but don't go off the edge. Actually, a bit of a longer zip would be better, and then you could pull it off the side and not worry about raising your presser foot or not as you get halfway along. But just stitch that with a 6mm or a 1/4 inch seam allowance along that top edge. If I didn't mention, colour should be to the right when that is closed. So let's stitch that. I've got my zipper foot on the machine. I'm using contrast thread just so you can see it clearly. Obviously match your thread to your lining fabric. That's our zip attached. Now I'm going to take that to the ironing board and I'm going to press that zip upwards so the seam folds down onto the pocket panel. And when you bring it back, it will look like it's upside down. The zip is on upside down. It isn't. That is the right way. So let me press that. So that's nicely pressed. So your zip looks like it's on upside down. That's fine. Flip it over to the back where your zip looks the right way around, and take your lower back lining panel. I'm going to turn that over. I've taken the tape off I've taken the backing off my sticky tape. Flip that over and you're going to centre that on the zip. So you're actually, that facing is the same width as well. So you want to sort of centre that on the same width as your facing. And I'm going to just stick that in place. And I'm lining up the top edge of the zip tape with the top edge of the body lining. So clip that in place. So those outer edges, the top outer edges are in line with the zip tape, and the body of the zip is falling into that gap we made, that nice rectangle. The lower part of the zip tape is concealed beneath rectangle, so you've got no raw edges. So pin or clip that in place. Have a look on the other side. Make sure that that pocket is lining up with your facing and everything's central. Flip it back over. Make sure your zip's open about 1/4 of the way. And then I'm going to top stitch the sides and bottom of the rectangle cutout with a 3mm or an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the edge. And that'll secure our zip in place. So down the side, across and back up that side. Move your zip halfway. We don't want any bumps. Trim. And that's my zip attached. So flip it over and trim any excess zip just to the width of the pocket piece. Get rid of any zip stoppers there if you have any. You don't want to stitch over those later. So flip it onto the reverse again and lift the bottom edge of that pocket bag and line it up with the top edge of the zip tape, and it should now match exactly. So top edge of the zip tape and top edge of the fabric at the sides. You can flip it over to make sure that you've got it exactly in line. Open your zip a third of the way again, or halfway. Open that pocket out so you can see that the top edge of that pocket is now falling along exactly the same line of the top there. So I'm now going to baste that in place. So baste along that top edge all the way along. It's actually easier to do it from the front so you can see what you're doing. So just catch everything in from one side right to the other. So we're just basting this on here. So just use a scant seam allowance of sort of 3mm or an 1/8 of an inch. There we are. So that's nice and secure. Flip it to the back, and now we want to secure the side seams. So we just literally need to stitch 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the pocket bag on both sides. I find it quite nice to take that stitching all the way to the bottom of the piece because it gives quite a nice profile stitch line on the front. Move that zip puller out of the way. Trim up again. So that's completed your pocket inside too, fully enclosed, no gaps. So now we want to put the top facing on. So open that zip third half of the way again and grab your upper back lining piece B. So I'm going to turn that so the curved edge is towards the bottom. I'm going to take my lower back lining piece, flip it over so it's right side down. So my upper lining is right side up, my lower lining is right side down, and I'm going to match that on top centrally and clip in place. Flip it over so you can see it's positioned well. Nice and straight. So it's that straight edge of both pieces we're lining up. You can see the right sides together, upper and lower lining. And now I'm going to take that to the machine. I'm going to stitch all the way across with a 6mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Don't forget to move your zip puller when you're halfway along. Raise your presser foot, whiz it out of the way. Now I'm going to take that to the ironing board. I'm going to press that upwards to open everything out, and your seams should be pushed towards the top curved edge. So there we are, nicely pressed. Seams facing up towards the curved edge. Just a little tip is to grab your pattern piece A at this point and just compare. It should be exactly the same size. Now, yes we are, that's great. It might change a little bit because of those seams. If you've taken a slightly different seam allowance, don't worry about the odd millimetre, that's fine. So now I'm going to top stitch along that top seam just to hold the seam allowance back 3mm or 1/8 of an inch from the edge, so all the way along this seam we've just made. That just finishes it nicely. Just a little bit of information here for you. We're not going to use this pocket to turn the bag through because the bag is smaller at the top than it is at the bottom, and it makes the pocket actually too small to turn the bag through, particularly if we've got foam and we've added a bag base. It just makes it too tight, so we are going to turn it through the bottom seam. So that's why it's a full piece. So now it's time to attach our main zip to the main body. So let's prepare our main zip. So take your 35cm or 14-inch zip, or your piece of continuous zip tape at 14 inches. And at the open end, I'm going to mark a line 2.5 centimetres or 1 inch from the end of the zip or from the stoppers. So again, I'm using pen just so you can see it clearly. Use chalk, don't want to see it afterwards. So you can see there, that line. And then I'm going to fold it at that line on each side. So the zip tape's at 90 degrees. So the teeth angle outwards. So let me show you. Just fold that over at the line. Fold the zip tape behind and out. Hoping you can see that. Let me put a pin in it. So again, let's do it to the other side. So fold along that line and then just bring the line up to the teeth on the other side, so you're kind of forming a right angle across there. Show you. There we are. So hopefully they should both match nicely. If it doesn't, go back and do it again, because we do want those to be matching. Have a look, mine's not exactly right, so I'm going to do it again. And see, that one is slightly longer, and that's because you can see my line there. I wanted to fold it exactly on that line and back. So let's just do that again. A little further down. It's worth just making sure it's right here, because that'll mean your zip will sit correct on your bag. There we go, that's better. You see they're lining up exactly now. Let's open that so you can see it. Hoping you can see that on camera. So now I'm just going to baste those in place. So I'm going to baste just along the very outer edge of the zip and off the end, just to hold it in place until I get it in position on the bag. You can, some people fold these as they get them to the bag, but I find I don't quite get them as accurate. So I'd rather do it before I know I've got them in the right place. If you stay right on the edge of the zip tape with that stitching, you're not going to see it afterwards. So there we go, that's held nice and firmly in place. Ready to insert into my bag. Trim up, never leave thread ends, because they just end up sticking out somewhere at the end and you won't be able to reach them as easily. Tiny pins work well for that, by the way. I do have a few of these tiny thin pins which help me when I'm doing intricate work. And make sure you have zigzagged that end of the zip, the closed end, because you're at risk of losing your zip puller later on otherwise. So grab your outer front panel. So front panel in outer, so if you put a badge on it or if you've got one that you prefer at the front, use that one first and lay it right side up. And then I'm going to make a mark on this curved edge. Let me grab a ruler. I'm going to make a mark just on this curved edge, 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch from the end. Again, don't use a pen. So along that curved edge, just measure 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch from the end and make a mark. I wouldn't actually notch it or clip it with scissors because you're going to weaken it, so just use a mark instead. Just make sure it's nice and clear. And then I'm going to lay my zip right way down, or right side down, on top. Now it's much easier to work with your zip open, so just position it so you know you've got the tape the right way up, and then open it up. And I'm going to position the folded open end of the zip so that it lines up, let's pull that side out of the way, with that 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch mark. So that's on the left hand side because we want the zip opening left to right. And that's our front panel. So when it's closed, our zip puller is to the left. So I'm going to clip that in place so you can see just where that right angle is. It'll be sitting on the mark that I made. Show you a bit better. There's the mark. My teeth are lining up with that. But the top edge of the zip tape is lining up with the top edge of the curve. So let's clip that in place. And then I'm going to work all the way around here, pinning or clipping rather, to the top edge of the curve. Grab lots of clips. So I'm going to work my way along. What I want to aim for, so I don't get any sort of rumples in my zip afterwards, is that at the point where we're going to be stitching along this zip at the 6mm seam allowance, that's the bit that's going to be lying flat. So you'll find that the zip tape does gather a little towards the top edge, but that's fine. We want our stitch line to be lying flat, or where our stitch line is going to be. You can draw a 6mm line on your zip if you like, just to make it more obvious. So you can see there, I'm keeping the zip tape in line with the top edge of the curve all the way along. I'm just sort of gently pulling that around. No need to clip it because, or make snips in your zip for this one, because it is a really gentle curve and it doesn't need it. And at one point that zip needs to be flat, and the point it needs to be flat is where that 6mm stitch line is. So you can see it's a little bit rumpled, if that's a word, along that top edge, and you might find that the zip teeth fold upwards a tiny bit. That's fine, just clip along. It doesn't matter which way these are. These clips are upwards. Clip along until you get to the 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch mark on the other edge. So just take a look at it, lay it flat, make sure it's nicely flat along that stitch line or imaginary stitch line. There we go. And then when we reach the second mark, we want to pull our zip down or veer it downwards towards the body of the bag, because we're going to stitch off. So our zip will go down and our stitching will come up this way. So we'll be following the line of the curve, but our zip will be veered down towards the body of the bag, so we'll actually end up with a loose zip tail. It won't be sewn in at this last 1 centimetre portion, or 3/8 of an inch. So let me position that properly and I'll show you a close-up. I'll just clip it to this side just so it stays in place. We won't be sewing down there. So you can see that second line, we want our zip to be veering offwards away. So our stitching will carry on and stitch a 6mm line all the way following the curve of the bag, but the zip will come down here so it won't be caught in the stitching by the time we get to that last 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. So let me clip that and we'll stitch that in place with a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. a stiletto can help here as well. So stitch edge to edge, making sure that that zip is not on the fabric at the last 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Take your time. Trim up and then I'll show you a close up. Okay, so at my mark on the left hand side, you can see the zip is lined up at the open end. So we've got 1 centimetre without zip that side, or 3/8 of an inch. Stitching all the way along, and then by the time it comes to this right hand side, our zip is veering off and we've got 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch without zip on that end. So you can see it's a little bit rumpled along that top edge, and my zip teeth are kind of sticking up a little bit on that outside and the zip teeth, but then that centre line where our stitching is the tape is nice and flat, and that's what we're aiming for. And this side is going to veer away. So just to mention, I actually prefer to work with clips on this zip rather than double-sided tape. It's personal preference, but I find it's a little more manoeuvrable with clips on this one. So again, just whatever you feel is right for you. So grab your lining piece here, A. So that's the full piece, not the one with the zip pocket in. And I'm going to lay that right side down on top, matching up that curved edge of the zip. Make sure your sides are lined up and your bottom's lined up, so everything's in line. Oh, there's a crisp from last night. And then I'm going to clip it in place all the way along that top edge. You can put a couple of clips in the sides as well, just to make sure nothing moves and everything stays aligned as you're doing it. So we're making a zip sandwich there, right sides together. Clip in place. So this side will go on a lot easier, because you're not manoeuvring anything, you're just stitching over the top of what's already there. When you come to this edge where your zip tail is, just make sure that that zip tail is pulled down. You don't want to catch it in that seam allowance at the top. You want to make sure that is still remaining tucked down and away. Put a couple of clips in just to hold the zip back as well. There we go. So now I'm going to stitch along that top edge again with a 6mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so it's stitching along the curve only, edge to edge. You can stitch from either side, stitch from the back and you can get closer into your zip, or stitch from the front and you can see where your original stitch line is and you can stitch right over that. I think I'll stitch from the back because it does enable me to get nice and close into that zip. Stiletto helps. Just keep going nice and slow. Slow and steady wins the race. You can keep making sure everything's in line. Trim. Take clips off. Have a peek if you want. Looking good. Make sure that zip tail is coming out, popping out, and it's not stitched into your seam anywhere at that edge. So now you'll notice that the edge or each side of the zip is a little V shape, and we want to stitch that with a seam allowance of 6mm as well. Now I find drawing this on really helps, because it's hard to spot the angle when you've actually got your foot in there. It's much easier to see it when it's drawn on. So draw that on. So that's a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance on those V's. So I'm going to sew that one, which is easy enough. And then I'm going to sew that one, but make sure that zip tail is pulled down. In fact, tuck it inside. You don't want to get that into these seams at all. So I'll fold that in and back. Just clip that out of the way. Leave your zipper foot on. It's much easier with your zipper foot on because you're still getting close to that zip. And I'll sew those. Maneuver that zip, don't catch it. Trim those up. Make sure you back stitch beginning and end. Now I'm going to snip into those V's because we're going to be turning that through, and we want to snip right down to the stitching on that V, both sides. And then trim the seam allowances back by around half, just so we're reducing bulk. It also helps to trim that corner off there, close to the stitch line, because there's a lot of bulk in there. This zip end you can leave on, you can trim it down, totally up to you. I'll probably just take it back to a few millimetres, 1/4 inch. Leaving it on adds strength. Taking it off, you definitely won't get a bump inside afterwards, but it is quite small, so just a little snip. Trim off those top edges, that top corner, because there is a lot of bulk there. And then I'm going to turn that through. I'm going to push out those corners where that little V is. You might need an implement, not a sharp one. A chopstick or something that you haven't got a point on, because you don't want to risk puncturing your fabric. So you can see the V has popped out there, and that's going to make for a really nice zip end finish. Do that on both sides, and I'm going to take that and give it a good press before we top stitch it. There we go. You can see how your zip has now popped out on that side. That's what we want. It's popping out just before that point. So let me give that a press. So there we are, nice and pressed. You might find it easier to just press a small section, a small section and a small section. You notice the zip looks a little bit too big at the moment. That's fine. When the bag's finished, it's going to fall inside and it'll fall flat. So that's fine. Now we're going to top stitch that curved edge. So just the curve from top corner to top corner. By the way, if you feel like you've got a little bit too much bulk on those corners, you can easily just nip in and take a little bit more away. I might take a little bit more of that zip away actually. There we go. Ooh. That went flying. Okay, so now just top stitch that curved edge, not onto the V's, just the curved edge from edge to edge. 3mm or 1/8 of an inch from the edge itself. I'm going to clip the two in place just so nothing moves when I do it. Keep it all lined up. Every little helps. There we go. You can also see why it's important now to zigzag stitch that end closed, because literally you're right at the end, it could easily fly off. So there we go, that's top stitched. Let me trim that up. So that's just the curve top stitched. We're not stitching those V's. And we're ready to apply the other side. Take those off. So grab your remaining outer back piece. So that's your piece A in outer that remains. And we're going to make that mark on the top edge again as we did previously. So 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch along the top edge of the curve. I want to make a mark for the start and end of my zip. take your completed outer panel and just zip that up for the time being, because we don't want any twisted zips. Turn it over so you're looking at the back of your completed outer panel, the lining, and lay it matching outer to outer onto your remaining piece A. And we'll do the same again. Line up the open end of the zip, or that right angle, with the 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch mark, and the tape against the top of the outer.
Wi-Fi is not set up. You can find instructions in the help section of your Alexa app.
That's interesting. And I thought I switched everything off. Okay, so we can open the zip again now. Actually pull that down away for the time being. Do the same again. So we're going to line that zip up all the way along to the other edge, clipping along the way. Make sure that is lying directly, or the top of the zip tape is lying directly on the top edge of the curve of the fabric. The place you want it to be flat is where you're going to be stitching, so it's that 6 millimetre or 1/4 of an inch line on the zip tape. I say draw it on if it helps. When we get to this edge, same again, we're going to veer that zip downwards. So we're going to be sewing off the zip tape but carrying on stitching the outer. So let's just bend that down. So there we go. So that's veering off when we get to this side. And that's actually the side you'll start stitching on this time. And we'll end with the zip teeth finishing on that mark on the other side. So we've got 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch clear on both sides without the zip. So let's stitch that on with our 6 millimetre 1/4 inch seam allowance. There we are, in place, trim. So my zip's veering off at that side, and the right angle finishes on the 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch mark on that side. Looking fine. Keep that side out of the way. And now we can grab our remaining lining piece. So here's our remaining lining piece with the zip pocket attached. Lay your outer right side uppermost, and lay your lining right side down on top. So we're matching up those curved edges again, and you should just be able to match that up nicely. Clip it in place just so you know you've got everything lined up, sides, top, bottom. And then we can clip that top zip edge again. So once again, that side, you've got your right angle, so not a problem. This side, make sure that zip tape is well out of the way. So you're going to stitch, or carry on, stitch along the curve, carry on here, but your zip tape stays well out of the way down here. I'll clip that at the side just to make sure it doesn't move. Okay, so stitch from either side. 6 millimetre or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way along the curved edge. There we are, so we're going to do the same thing with the V's again. So let me grab my pen and draw them on. We're going to do a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance on the V's too. Keep that zip tail tucked out of the way. In fact, I'll kind of fold that way to make it easier. Fold it in. Draw it on. Clip it in place so that zip doesn't move. We'll stitch those V's. Trim, trimity, trim, trim. And then same thing again, we're going to snip into the corner of those V's, right down to the stitch line, both sides. Make sure my zip tail's in the right place before I do it, yeah. And then trim my seam allowances back by about half. Trim that point off the top a little bit, because that's where you'll get most of the bulk, that top point. Same on this side. Top point. Zip tail, I'll trim it down a bit, but again, whatever you prefer. And let's turn that through. Have a look at my little points, make sure they're looking nice. And then I shall press that again, and we'll have a look at our curved zip. So let me press that in place too. There we go, so that's my second side pressed. Now we're ready to top stitch that side. If you want to zip it up, just have a look. You can see now how the zip falls inwards. So because this zip is curved upwards, it will fall nice and flat, although it looks big when the piece is flat. Once it's in its formed shape, it looks the right size. So we're going to top stitch that top curved edge on this side, just as we did previously. So we're not top stitching the V's, we're just top stitching that top curved edge. So make sure I've got everything lining tucked down out of the way. I want to make sure my top stitching falls nicely onto the lining inside too. Yeah, okay. Keep your zipper foot on again, just so you can get close to the zip teeth. So curve only. Super. And you know what time it is now, don't you? We've done a lot of work there. It's got to be time for a tea break. Zip it up. How good's that? It's going to be lush. So get yourself a nice cup of tea, a nice chocolate biscuit. I need a chocolate biscuit in the middle of a project just to reward myself. Have a look at what you've achieved. See, that zip that you thought was going to look really wonky won't when you finished it. You can see when it's flat, it does look like it's not going to fall right, but once it's in position in the end bag, it will be fine. So have a little break, put your feet up, and we'll get ready to put the final touches to the bag. So have a brew, have a break, you deserve it in the middle of a pattern. Enjoy what you've done so far. I always like my chocolate biscuit break in the middle of a pattern. But after the Christmas excesses, I thought, do you know what, I should really limit my intake of chocolate biscuits to no more than 1 packet a week. So I've got my packet for this week anyway. And boy, I love a Jaffa cake. Right, so that's tea breaks over, no more chocolate allowed till the end. It's time to do our first outer side seam. So make sure your zip is closed fully. Make sure nothing's twisted. And then open it halfway. If you have it all the way, you might twist the two together, so just make sure you're right first. So open your bag so you've got outers together and linings together, right sides together. So outer against outer, lining against lining. And we're just going to stitch one of the side seams, and we're going to stitch the one that's got the tail. So we're only going to stitch the outer side seam too, we're not going to stitch the lining. So I'm going to clip that side seam together, nothing else, just that one side seam. So tuck that tail in, out of the way. You don't want to touch that, don't want to get it caught in anywhere. Swivel it round. Make sure that you're matching these two seams exactly, because that's what's going to be really visible on your bag. Not really visible, it'll be hidden by the strap, but if you know, you might spot it. You can trim these side seams down, not side seams, you can trim these seams down a tiny bit if you want, there's not much there. But it all helps with bulk. So match that seam, seam to seam. You can nest them so you can have one seam going upwards and one seam going downwards if you like. Just make sure, really pay attention to the fact that they really are lying on top of each other, because that's where you're going to spot it. And then line up the rest of the side seam. So we're going to stitch that side seam, but we're also going to stitch just an inch or 2.5 centimetres onto the lining side. That's all. We're not going to stitch down the whole lining yet. So I'll clip it in place just to make sure it's all folding in place, but we're not stitching all the way down it. Okay, so you find it bends a bit like that, that's fine. So I'm going to stitch with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way along that side seam of the outer, finishing just an inch or 2.5 centimetres onto the lining. We want the lining to stay open at the moment. You can leave your zipper foot on if you want, it's easier to get close into that seam at the top because you might have a zip end or not, whichever you prefer. Put your hand in and pull that zip tail away. Make sure it's nowhere near. If you're using a really hefty fabric, you can always use a hump jumper to help you over that little hump there. That's a bit wonky, I might sort that out. I'll just go over that bit again, it wasn't very straight. That's because my zip tail was in the way and I didn't get my hump jumper in properly. There, just straighten that bit out. And now I'm going to trim the bulk away from this inside seam. So just down by half, something like that. That's the only place really that you're going to incur the bulk. There we are. And then nip to the ironing board and press that seam open. It really does help. I won't in this case because it's waterproof canvas, it probably won't do anything anyway, but I'll clip it for now. Now I'm going to put that to one side for a sec and I'm going to grab my webbing. So take your webbing and cut an 86 centimetre or 34 inch length. This bag has got a short underarm strap, as I said, that's the style of it, but if you prefer a longer strap, you can just increase the webbing length as you require, whatever suits you, especially if you know you're going to wear it over really heavy coats or you're very tall. I'm not. But just increase or decrease, however you like. So I'm going to attach a badge to this. So just my woven label. It just looks quite nice on this webbing. So I'm going to attach that 12 centimetres or 4 3/4 inches up, and I'm going to put the middle of my label at that point. So about there. Don't go any higher because it'll get in the way of your stitching otherwise. So centralised it over the webbing. And I'll just stitch that one. Obviously I'm speed sewing here today, so I haven't changed my thread. I should really change the thread to match the label. But there we go, that's attached. And now we're going to attach the first side of this webbing. So, grab your unit so far. I'm going to open that out fully. So open your zip fully. Make sure that seam is lying open and flat underneath. So we have our right side uppermost. Your lining's up here out of the way. The outer is separate down here. So we're just going to be working on this outer. So we're going to add a webbing handle. We're going to add it centrally to that seam. So I'm going to add a bit of double-sided tape there too. I'm not going to go all the way up because we're not going to stitch all the way up. So we're going to stitch about 6.5 inches, I think. I've just got it there. So with your webbing the right side up, so your label towards the top, there probably isn't a right and wrong side to your webbing. Match the raw edge of the webbing to the raw edge of that cutout, centrally, so central on the webbing to that side seam. And lay it centrally all the way up. So you can see when you get to the top, that webbing is still central with your side seams there. Okay. So hold that in place with your double-sided tape. You can always stick a little clip in the top bit just so it doesn't move. And then I'm going to stitch around that webbing. I'm going to stitch a rectangle. I'm going to draw a line on the top, definitely in chalk this time because I won't be able to get rid of it. I'm going to draw the line 16.5 centimetres or 6.5 inches up from that bottom edge. It doesn't really matter. You can go lower if you're worried about going onto your side seam or not being able to get far enough up. You can do it shorter. But I find that's quite a nice height. 6.5 inches, 16.5 centimetres. And just stitch a rectangle around there up to that 16 centimetre line, back down again just to secure it in place. Keep it close to the edge and do make sure you use a matching thread unless you want to make a feature of it. Make sure it's staying nice and straight over that side seam. Pivot and turn at the line. Trim up, brush your line off, and that's one side attached. Very pretty. So you could add a box stitch at the top of there if you wanted to. I find it's not really necessary because you're not going to be pulling the straps apart as such. They're coming upwards, so there's not really going to be any pressure on there. But you can stitch a box there or a cross in a box if you prefer. Remember, you've got to do it at the other side when the side seams are actually stitched together, and you've got a tube though, so the less is more, shall we say. So now we're going to stitch the second side seam. So keep your webbing well up here out of the way and flip that over. So you've got right sides facing, right side of outer facing right side of outer, and we'll clip that side seam in place now. So same again at the top here. Make sure that your seams are falling exactly in line. Nest them if you want to. My last one wasn't brilliant actually. Line up the rest. And we'll stitch over just 2.5 centimetres or an inch onto the lining side as previously. So let's stitch that. with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, starting just above the top of the outer. Use your hump jumper if you need it, just where it crosses over the zip. We don't want to catch the zip in though, of course. Right, so we've now got a tube. Let's go and press that side seam open again. So you can put a tailor's ham inside or a towel, anything to help you actually press that open. So I've attempted to press that open. You know what waterproof canvas is like, I don't really like pressing. So we're now going to attach the other side of the webbing. So turn it back the right way through. Grab your webbing, make sure it's coming up flat and bring it right over the top. So you've got your strap here, not twisted, double check. I'm going to do the same thing here, so I'm going to attach it centrally to the side seam. So grab a bit of double-sided tape, or you can pin it, whichever you prefer. Try and keep that side seam, the seam allowances open at the back if you can, but don't worry if you can't. It's not the end of the world. This is the end of the world when I can't pick it off. There we go. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Just not liking it. There we go. Right. So strap, make sure it's flat, coming straight up and over, and then centre it on the bottom of our cutout, or on the top of our cutout, right over the side seam, central on the strap. All the way to the, make sure it's straight all the way to the top. I don't like that. Let's do it again. There we go. My webbing looked a bit tight. Put a little clip in. And we're going to do the same thing again. Open that side seam. Oh, it does what it wants, this flipping fabric. There we go. So I'm going to stitch it in a box again. Let's make our mark at 6.5 inches. And then it's a little bit more difficult, obviously, to stitch this side because you've got to get into it. Always worth working on the free arm if you have one. So you can either stitch from the outside like this and sort of scrunch up the rest of it to get in, because it's fine once you're going up there, but then you've got to turn, pivot and come back down again. So the other option is, I think my testers really found this a lot easier, is to turn it inside out again and work from the inside of the bag. It's not too bad when it's thin layers like this. It's when you get really thick layers of vinyl that you're going to start, it's going to start looking a bit more awkward. So I'm going to work from the inside of the bag, so I'll start there. So you're holding this part out of the way, almost holding it up like a tunnel. So you're going to sew up the tunnel, across, pivot and back down the other side. So we're sewing close to the edge of the webbing. So you're holding it up and stitching up the tube or up the tunnel. Pivot at the top, move your bulk around, back down the other side. There we are, that's your webbing attached. Let's have a quick look, make sure we're happy with it. Tuck your lining inside so we can make sure we've not got anything twisted. Yeah, so that's looking good. Happy with that. Starting to come together. See how those straps hold the side seams nicely. Give it form. So let's turn that inside out again. So now I'm ready to do the bottom seam of my outer. So let's clip that in place, and this is where you can decide whether you want to add a bag base or not, depending on how structured you want your bag, how flimsy your fabric is. So for this one I definitely want to add it, but by not adding it, it just looks a more casual bag. It's not right or wrong with or without, so it's totally up to you. So if you don't want to add a bag base, just clip that in place and stitch that bottom seam with a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance. No problem. If you do want to add the bag base, grab your piece F. So obviously I've done loads of bag bases and I always think they're a bit of a faff. You know, cutting them to the right size. Is it the right size? You can make them removable, not removable. Stick them on afterwards, and they always are really faffy, so I was trying to come up with something different. So I think this is a much easier way of doing it, and it seems to line up a lot easier and flip into place a lot easier as well, and is held into place. So I'm going to call this the Beanie Base Flip. And piece F can be cut in anything, Decaville heavy, mesh bag base, vinyl, anything that's sort of ultra firm to give us a nice stiff base. So take your pattern piece. It's shorter than the bottom of the bag because we don't want it to go into the side seams, and we don't want to hit the stitching onto the fabric itself, onto the ultra firm stabilizer. So transfer the line, the positioning line, from the pattern piece onto your fabric. If you are using something fusible, by the way, mark it on the fusible side. All that is the centre line plus the seam allowance. So I'm going to line that up on the bottom of the bag. I'm going to centre it exactly across the piece. As I say, we don't want to catch our stitching into it. You can always cut it a tiny bit shorter if you're worried about catching the stitching into it, because that'll kind of spoil it a little bit if you do. So as I say, no harm in cutting a bit shorter if you're worried about it. And then attach that there. You can either use a pin or two. You can sort of dab the iron onto it and fuse it on. First time I did it though, I managed to fuse all my clips along with it, so I'll just stick a pin in it for now. Clip it on at the sides. So we want to incorporate it when we stitch our seam. So because the centre line of that bag base is just up above here, when we stitch our centre line it'll then flip into place. So now you can stitch your bottom seam with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You can draw your seam allowance on if you want to, because it's important that it is exact to make sure that that lands exactly at the centre. See, so now when we open the bag, that will flip to the centre. No messing about, it's staying there forever in the right place. It's not moving around inside your bag. You don't have to struggle to put it on after you've done your bottom seam. So it's quite a nice little trick to use on any bag. So that's our bottom seam done. If you didn't put the bag base on, you can press that seam open. If you did, no point, because it's going to go to one side. As I say, you don't need it on a heavy vinyl or a bulky fabric. It's just not necessary, but it's great when you're using a flimsy fabric. It will really hold its own and make the bag really nicely structured. So I'm calling that my Beanie Base Flip. Right, so whichever method you use, whether you added the base or not, let's continue on from here. So now it's time to box the side seams. So it's quite a nice, easy operation, this one. So turn your bag inside out if it's not already. And we're going to kind of stand it up a little bit. And put your hands inside. You know the best way to box corners. So as you see, bag is inside out. I'm going to lay the side seam over the bottom seam on both sides. But if you hold it up, let your lining drop to the sides, or even clip it up out of the way and flatten that side seam so it lines up with the bottom seam. I'm going to clip one there, turn it round, do the same there. So the centres of the bag are out here. Make sure it's nice and straight, nice and open. Make sure that seam, that side seam, is lined directly on top of the bottom seam. If you peek inside, you'll be able to see the centre of your webbing should be on the centre of that bottom seam. Make sure it's fully open so you can see it, and that will mean you haven't got a twisted bag when you open it out afterwards, because what we tend to do is just pull the corners together and hope for the best, but unless they're all lined up, you can see in the middle those straps are meeting, the seams are all lying on top of each other. If you kind of hold the line out of the way, you can see it's a kite shape and it's nice and equal. So that will mean your bag is nicely formed too, and there's no twisting in it. Plenty of clips, and then I'm going to stitch those box corners with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure you do back stitch beginning and end, both sides, and then when you've done your seam allowance, I'd stitch another one just inside, just on the seam allowance, just for extra security. In fact, you know what, if you stitch from the other side, you'll be able to see your bag base if you added one as well, so you can make sure you just miss that, because you don't want to catch that in the stitching. So that's one line of stitching. You can see it's not touched my bag base, and I'll sew another line of stitching just inside that on the seam allowance. Yeah, showing that. So let's see our 2 lines of stitching. It's not stitched over the bag base. Let's do the same on the other side. Let's flip it over this time so we can see the bag base and make sure we're not hitting it. Nicely trimmed. You don't need to trim this seam allowance off at all, you can just leave it. So let's now finish off the lining. So turn it round, push that strap inside, push your zip end inside, you don't want to catch those in. And line up your sides and your bottom of the lining, so your lining is right sides together. Make sure everything falls neatly in line, and clip. And we're going to leave a turning gap on this bottom seam. So I think I've said in the pattern leave a turning gap of about 18 centimetres or 7 inches, but basically it's just to get you around those corners so you've still got room for boxing the corners and leaving as big a gap as possible. So let's stitch side seams, bottom portion, leaving the turning gap, and the other side seam. With a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, however, if you increase that slightly by about 1/2 centimetre or 1/4 of an inch, that will ensure that you don't have any baggy lining inside. So I'm going to just increase that slightly as I go on this side. So we only need to start just over on the lining side. You can see where your stitch line ends, so just start there. And then grade your seam allowance, increase it a bit as you go. And then once you're past the bottom, start grading it back in to meet your seam line from previous. There we go. Now we're nearly there. We're ready to box those corners. But just before we do that, to help us close it neatly at the end, I'm just going to nip to the ironing board. I'm going to press up that hem on the bottom edge. It'll just give us a much cleaner closure at the end, so on both sides. So there we are, press that up. This is the last time you're going to see your lining flat, by the way, as well, so it's worth pressing that while it's nice and flat and easy. So we'll leave that open, that's how we're going to turn the bag through, but first let's box the corners here. So just in the same way we did with the outer, stand up. In fact, I should have pressed those open as well, those side seams. I apologise, do press those open if you can. So just match seam to seam at the box corners. I'll match them first and then we'll just go back and make sure it's straight. See how nicely that bag base is popping out now, by the way. So let's have a look. So bring the side seams in together, just make sure everything's in line. It's not quite as imperative on the lining, of course, because you're not really going to see it, but it's nice to make sure it is lined up lovely. So make sure that this bottom seam is lined up nicely with the side seams. Clip those in place, both sides. Let's check that one. Is it flattening nicely onto my side seam? Yes, that's good. So again, we'll now stitch those with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance again. Don't be tempted, by the way, to increase the seam allowance on those box corners, because what that would do was would actually mean your box corners would become wider, so it wouldn't fit the bag. So stick with your 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance there. So it's getting exciting, it's time to turn it through. So put your hand inside, shouldn't be too hard with a nice wide opening here. Fingers in, shouldn't need anything but fingers to push the corners out. That bag base should just fold nicely into position, lining inside. Let's have a look at it. Yep, she's looking good. So let's close our lining up, pull the lining right back out again and match the seams. So just pull them together, and because we pressed it, those seam allowances should fall nice and neatly inside, and it should all match beautifully in a straight line. And then we're going to top stitch that closed, really close to the edge. Final trim. Push your lining back inside. Looking good. You can give it a final press now or wait till you've done your zip ends. So make sure those sides are falling nice and neatly and give those a press to make sure they're nice and flat. I will give this bag a quick press first because they're not lying entirely flat yet, and we're going to top stitch those optionally. You don't need to, because you can't really see them, the straps, hiding them out of the way, and it isn't necessary for anything. It's just if you want to add a final bit of a flourish, you could either go around the whole thing or just do a little line at the top or the bottom of the V, shall we say, there, just to hold it in place. Let me press it first and let's have a look. So I've given it a quick press just to make sure my V's are nice and flat. I'm just going to top stitch in there. As I say, you don't need to do it at all, it's totally optional, but I'm just going to nip in there and stitch down, across and back up. 3mm or 1/8 inch from the edge. In fact, I shall take the bed off the machine, work on the free arm, it'll be easier. Okay, that's one side done. Just hold it in place. Do the other side. Hold your zip tail up and out of the way when you're doing this side, and the strap, of course. So your zip tail would go onto the bed of the machine and out of the way, upwards. Yeah, trim that one up as well. Right, so the only thing left to do is deal with our zip end. So that's quite a long one. Zip it up, make sure you're happy with everything, make sure it's not twisted. So we want to get rid of some of this. So the choice is yours. You can have it remaining outside the bag. If so, I would cut it to a very short tail and maybe put a metal zip end on it. I'm just going to tuck it inside the bag. So I'm going to put a fabric zip end on it. So I've given you a pattern piece for a fabric zip end. The easiest way to cut that out, I find, because we need to use non-frame fabric, because obviously we don't want the bother of turning in all the edges. It's so much simpler. So a piece of cork, a piece of vinyl, a piece of leather. I find the easiest thing is just to stick it on with a bit of clear tape and then cut round it, because they are so small and fiddly. Kind of holds it in place while you do it. So I'm going to cut that zip tail down. So for me, I'm going to tuck it in the bag, so I don't need it too short. So I'm going to cut it down to 2.5 inches or 7 centimetres. So just measure from the very end of where it comes out of the bag. So 7 centimetres. It's just rough, nothing major. And then I'm going to turn in the edges of the zip tape like that, just to make it smaller. And I'm going to tack that in place, like fold that strap out of the way underneath. So fold your zip tape behind. So you've got the zip tape teeth on the top and the tape's folded up behind. I'm going to clip that in place, and I'm just going to put a tack in it on the machine. You don't need to, but I just find I like a bit of extra security. Then I'm going to take my zip end and I'm going to add a bit of glue. I find that's the easiest way. You can just clip it on round it, but I find this is a much easier way to tackle it. Double-sided tape, of course, but you need to use double-sided tape on both sides of the zip tab. Never wants to come out when you need it to. There we are. I'm using Beacon Fabri-Tac, very useful. So make sure your zip is coming out nice and equal. And I'm going to drop it onto one side. That was a quick drop. Fold it over. Just make sure it's nice and straight in that zip end. So you've still got time with the glue to fiddle around with it, make sure it's in place, of course. There we go. So now I can stitch around that zip tab. I'll probably give it a few minutes just for the glue to dry, but stitch around the zip tab, rectangle all the way around, close to the edge, about 3mm or 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Hump jumper if it helps. There's your zip end. I'm going to trim that down a little bit. So once you put it on, you can still trim it down a touch, as long as you're not touching your stitching. There we go. And then I'm going to tuck that inside my bag. So just feed it into that gap on the end. You see, it does look quite nice hanging out if it's on the wash bag. If you want to make the cosmetic bag version without the straps, then it does look nice with the zip tail hanging out, but because the straps are sort of feeding upwards, it doesn't necessarily look right with your zip feeding upwards unless you put a very short zip end on it. So there we go. Right, I'm going to give that a final press and then we'll have a look at it. So I hope you've enjoyed making the Beanie Baguette with me today, and you found the tutorial easy to follow along with. I hope you made a bag that you're really pleased with. Now you've made that one, why not try a different version? Try it without the straps, which is really quick and easy. Just follow the pattern exactly, but leave out the straps. And it makes a lovely zippy pouch. Nice size. Or I've also included a bonus pattern of a smaller size. Let's call it a baby beanie. And you can make that again with strap to make a lovely glamorous evening bag, or even a bag for a child. And also do the same again and without straps, and it makes a lovely matching zippy pouch too on a smaller scale. So there's loads of options to go at. Try different fabrics, different sizes, with and without straps. What are you waiting for? Go sew!